Hey everybody, welcome back to the Jason W. Hoyt Show. My name is Jason W. Hoyt. You can find out more about the program at jasonwhoyt.com. That's jasonwhoyt.com. And today I'm going to kick off a series we're calling the Introduction to the Independent Grand Jury, or the reintroduction, if you will. And for those of you that know me and know my previous writing and research, you know that this is a re-kicking off, a reigniting of interest in how independent the grand jury is supposed to operate. And I would say over the past year, there's been more and more people reaching out to me interested in the first book. And so what I'm going to do in this series is kind of reintroduce the concept, give you a little bit of my background information. And for those of you that know me, for those of you that know about the book, some of this will be repeat. I've done a lot of additional research. I'm going state by state, and I'll present some of that today. But I want to recommend to you that you save this video, because as this issue, as interest in this concept and this great, phenomenal tool that the people have still to this day, you're going to want to forward this on to people to try to explain this. This will be a great introduction. Now, I'm not going to present to you the Magna Carta and the clauses and state constitutions and Supreme Court cases and all of that, and law review articles describing what happened in 1946 with the coup d'etat of the people's most powerful weapon for government accountability. I won't be presenting all that in today's video. I'll discuss it. But if you want those show notes, go to hoyt.me. That's hoyt.me. I'll send you an ebook to my latest book. I'll send you that download. I'll also invite you to an online community that I started a short time ago that it's focused on finding real solutions to restoring liberty. It's called the Liberty Restoration Society. I'll send you an invitation to that. We actually have a group within that community that focuses on the independent grand jury. A lot of those show notes, a lot of that research is there, and I'm actually in the process of rewriting, representing with additional research the whole concept, and a lot of that stuff is in that community as well. So go to hoyt.me for those show notes. So I want to dig into a little bit of my background, my history, what led up to me writing the first book, because I did not begin the process of writing that book with a focus of the grand jury. I did not say, hey, I'm going to write a book about the grand jury, because, wow, who would, right? Especially at that stage. There was a question that I had that I wanted to get answered, that I was going after, that it was about accountability. Is there such a thing? But let me back up before I get to that, before I get to the book, before I get to the Fifth Amendment and the most powerful word in the Constitution, which is still there. I've been called a political archaeologist. Tom Gatens in Tampa, Florida area, Tea Party guy, phenomenal patriot. He says Hoyt is a political archaeologist, uncovering what's been there all along. And it's still there. But let me dig into that a little bit. So I've always been, quote unquote, on the right. You know, I've been a Republican, registered Republican and all of that. And I always paid attention in all of this. But back in 2003 was kind of my political awakening, if you will. That's when I got up off the couch and said, I've got to get engaged in the process. I'm tired of just watching what's going on and not doing anything. And in fact, early in social media days, I found a quote that I liked. I kind of modified it a bit and added a picture to it. And I put on here, it says, I always wondered why somebody didn't do something about that. Then I realized I am somebody. And that's so fitting, because that was in 2003. My buddy of mine, Dallas, I think it was his mom who was aware of the Orange County, and I was in Florida then. Orange County is Orlando. She said, hey, there's Orange County Young Republicans. So I joined that club. Got engaged with a bunch of people, and I think Young Republicans, 18 to 40, and got engaged with them, volunteered like crazy. I mean, we were so engaged in the process. This was Bush Cheney versus Lurch, what's his name, John Kerry. That was when he said, I voted for it before I voted against it, and I found that hypocrisy just absolutely obnoxious. It's like, I can't believe that people would fall for that and get away with that kind of stuff, and pales in comparison to what we see today, but that was enough for me back then to get up off the couch. And in fact, 19 of us went to the inauguration for Bush in January 2005. Great time. It was awesome being engaged. And I stayed engaged with Orange County Young Republicans, the Republican Executive Committee, Actually, I became the president of the Orange County Young Republicans in 2000, was that 6? Something like that, 5 or 6. And I was a district chair. I was committee man, precinct committee man, and then a district chair in the Republican Executive Committee. So I went election cycle after election cycle, stayed engaged in the process as a volunteer, worked my tail off for the Republican Party. And after a while, because remember back then for me, it was Republican good, Democrat bad, our guy good, their guy bad. That was the fight. That was the debate. And we basically memorize the talking points and go out there and debate people and talk to people about issues. But I after a while, I got tired of apologizing for our guy. The spending. Well, there's so many issues that I could go through, but I won't here for the sake of just saying that back then it was Republican Party politics. Tea Party comes along. God put me at the right place at the right time. I was on the original conference calls that launched the Tea Party movement. And that enabled me to step outside the party politics argument. And that enabled me to stand next to a set of principles and values, foundational American principles and values that every single time they are implemented, they work for the betterment of everyone. And I didn't have to apologize and make excuses for people within our party, quote unquote, because it was about principle at that time. And so even then, I used to say I put my old life on hold, and I did a deep dive and I was all in, but I didn't put my old life on hold. I said I'm never going back. I am an awake American, and I am doing a deep dive to understand why this country was founded, how it was founded, and how it's supposed to work. And so through the years after the Tea Party, back then, remember it was actually, here's a quick story on Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan, if you remember him, congressman out of Wisconsin, who eventually became Speaker of the House. Of all the frustrations, I'll get to that. Hang on a second. So a lot of people love Paul Ryan. Great energy, young guy. Remember when Romney chose him as his VP pick? A lot of people love Paul. Oh, Paul Ryan, he's young. He's a budget hawk, and he's all this and all that. And I knew his history to a degree. And I wanted to warn people about it. So when he was chosen as the VP pick by Romney, I was like, hey, guys, I called up Clyde at the West Orlando Tea Party. I said, can I speak tonight? And he's like, yeah, I know what you're going to say. And there's a few hundred people there, a bunch of brand new people, actually. And I said, how many people here are new? About 30 people raised their hand. I said, well, just to make sure we're all on the same page, you guys are all in the right room. How many of you guys are upset about TARP and the bank bailout? People were raising their hand. How many of you were upset about the GM bailout? And then I said, what about the mortgage bailout? And then, how many of you were upset about the Patriot Act extension, the indefinite detention of American citizens and that threat? And everyone just turned into a rally at this point. I said, how many of you know that Paul Ryan voted for every single one of those things? And that was a big warning to people. And so not just those issues, but there's so many more issues. I remember in my first book, Consent to the Governed, The People's Guide to Holding Government Accountable, when I did that deep dive on the grand jury, I've got a section there called Facepalm Headlines. These are the headlines that you just can't believe happened in America. Right? There was this story of, I think it was Oregon, a guy spent 30 days in jail for collecting rainwater on his own property. Fifth Amendment, 14th Amendment, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. He collected rainwater. How did that happen? He ended up in jail for 30 days. There's stories in there. There's a guy who was arrested twice in 1 week for feeding the homeless. I think that was in Fort Lauderdale. Those things happen in Orlando as well. How can there be some sort of city code or something where you're not allowed to feed the homeless? Give me a break. In America, really? There's so many. I saw these stories about people who in San Diego, I think it was. They had these fines for hosting Bible studies in their houses without a permit. How does that happen in America? So I'm reading this stuff. There's actually a story of Andrew Clyde, who actually now is a congressman, I believe. I need to talk to him. I'm going to talk to him in some days, weeks, months ahead. But I remember seeing his story on Greta Van Susteren. He was an Iraq war vet, served a couple tours. He comes back and he's got a small business. I think it was a gun shop. Maybe that was the reason why. But IRS goes to him and says, "Hey, by the way, just so you know, we confiscated $940,000 from your bank account." It's like, what? What do you mean you confiscated it? It said, "Yeah, you were structuring." So it's like, wait a minute. Again, Fifth Amendment, 14th Amendment. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. There was no due process. They took his property, $940,000 from his bank account. Said he was structuring. And if you guys know, for whatever, well, I know there are reasons, but anyways, not saying they're right. But if you deposit $10,000 or more in the bank at a time, I think the bank has to report that to the IRS just so they know about it, whatever. Well, he was making a series of deposits in cash that were under $10,000. They was suspicious, so they confiscated $940,000. Within that week, he gets on the phone with his attorney, his accountant, and the IRS. Said, "Hey, what's going on?" I said, "Well, we'll do an internal investigation." Of course they will. They do an internal investigation, and after, I figure it was weeks, maybe months, they come back and they say, "By the way, you did nothing wrong. Would you settle for $600,000 back?" Can you believe that? $940,000 taken, no due process. He was never charged with a crime. The investigation never led up to any charges. And they say, "Will you settle for $600,000 back?" But I remember on this Greta Van Susteren interview, he says, "Well, I did a tactical retreat and I settled for $900,000 back." Why he settled for anything less than $940,000 plus attorney's fees plus interest, I have no idea why. But he settled for $900,000 back. And Greta asked him a very important question. She says, "Well, after that, all in, how much did you lose?" He says, "All in, I lost $150,000. Why does that happen in America? There's some other really big issues that I dig into that is so egregious, just unbelievable how unfair. We don't have a legal system. I'm sorry, we don't have a justice system. The justice system based on right versus wrong. We have a legal system based on what's legal, illegal. There's a guy who wrote a book a number of years back. I'm going to mess it up. Silverglate, something like that. And excuse me. And he his book was called 3 Felonies a Day. He said the criminal code of conduct is so voluminous that I got to take a cough drop. Excuse me. That the average American commits 3 felonies per day without even knowing. And that allows the state's attorneys, district attorneys, excuse me, this will all be edited out for the final. This allows them to pick and choose who to go after. So I find so many things happening to Americans that are completely unfair, completely egregious. I mean, the bullying done by the government, even the FBI, like right now, where the Constitution is supposed to protect us from cruel and unusual punishment, whereas the actual raids that happen on people's homes, I'm not just talking about Trump, but I'm talking about this pastor and these other people, like in a COVID lockdowns and stuff, but the raids on people's homes and what it does to destroy people who are innocent. There was a recent story from a guy who was charged in that FBI plot to entrap people in the made-up story of trying to kidnap the Michigan governor. He was acquitted, so he's innocent. Guilty. A jury of his peers did not find him guilty, so he's innocent. Well, his life's destroyed because of that whole entire process. This pastor recently, who he was wrong and he hurt somebody or whatever, infringed on other people's rights, but he was going to turn himself in, blah, blah, blah. Peaceful guy. They send in the SWAT or whatever it was. That in and of itself is cruel and unusual punishment. Anyways, So my question at the time of writing the first book, I began the process asking the question, is there such a thing as accountability? Is there such a thing as holding our government accountable? And the answer I came to at the time was, we've been trained to think that the only way we can hold our government accountable is by waiting for the next election, where maybe, just maybe, if if enough of us knock on enough doors and raise enough money for our favorite candidate, maybe, just maybe, they'll win. And maybe if enough people around the country do the same thing, maybe they can get together once they're in Washington, D.C., and maybe, just maybe, they can pass a law to give us our rights back. And that's absurd to me. Because you can't convince me that after what the founders went through, severing ties with the king, declaring independence to the world, being willing to fight the world's mightiest military in a multi-year war, winning that fight, having the opportunity to create a system of government, of self-government. You can't convince me that they then put in place a system where the only redress of grievances the people have is by waiting for the next election, and maybe, just maybe, we might get our rights back someday. You can't convince me that's what they did. And lo and behold, through the research, I discovered that's not what they did. We actually do have a tool at our disposal. It's sitting there right in the Fifth Amendment. The most powerful word in the Constitution is sitting right there in the Fifth Amendment today. And there are remnants that it still exists throughout the country. The people just don't know it yet. If you want to have access to some of the show notes and some of that research, go to hoyt.me. That's hoyt.me, and I'll send that stuff to you. And in fact, I'll send you an invite to my online community where we're discussing this stuff as we speak. There's been a resurgence in interest in this. I've had multiple people contact me. They buy 100 books at a time and hand them out to their organizations, to their groups. And it's been a long time coming. So let me dig into that here for just a little bit. I'm going to just kind of wet your whistle here in this introductory video. When I say the grand jury, the independent grand jury, what is a grand jury? The grand jury is us. It is made up of the people. It's not made up of a bunch of lawyers. We're not waiting for them. We're not waiting. This is one of the big concepts that I'm trying to tackle, that I'm trying to surface and discuss with people, is this idea that in order to navigate in this country, you have to have an accountant and a lawyer. To me, that's not freedom. The tax code is so crazy that to stay out of jail, you have to have an accountant. You have to have and the better accountant, the more expensive accountant you have, the better off you're going to do. Right? That's not freedom. And the same thing goes for starting a business. In order to start a business and stay out of jail and comply with every code, local, state, and federal, you have to have an accountant. The barriers to entry just to start a business, to be an entrepreneur, to be a small business owner, the barriers to entry are crazy. So we've outsourced this important responsibility to the legal class, if you will. So what is a grand jury? It's not that. It's not them. Scalia in 1992 referred to it as, it said, unfettered by technical rules where the layperson can investigate. And I'll dig into that 1992 Supreme Court case where it's just voluminous, writing for the majority, where Scalia, what I have in the book is about 2.5 pages of insight into how independent the grand jury is supposed to operate. But when you look at the grand jury, well, to back up, the Declaration of Independence declared to the world that our rights come from God, not man. And it says we have unalienable rights. We do not get our rights from the Constitution. We don't get our rights from the government. We don't get our rights from democracy, from the mob, from the majority of people. We get our rights from God. They are unalienable, which means they cannot be given or taken away. The Declaration of Independence says, and to secure these rights, governments instituted among men. The proper role of government is to secure our rights. That's the reason why government was created, was to protect our rights. And then it says, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That's where government gets its powers, is from our consent. And that consent is not given just at the ballot box. That consent is given every single day in the jury box. And how do we do that also? How do we form that government? It was with the Constitution. The Constitution, written by we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, blah, 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 you know the thing. It created the government. Article 1 created the legislative branch. Article 2 created the executive branch. Article 3 created the judicial branch. Now, where in the Constitution was the grand jury created? It wasn't. It's mentioned in the Fifth Amendment, but it's not in the body of the Constitution. I just quoted Scalia, by the way, that little piece there. He talked about how the grand jury is outside of our branches of government. It is us. Look at these presidential polls. You ever see a presidential poll? They poll, 500 people? Less than 1,000, but let's say 500 people they poll. And this random poll is supposed to represent the voice of the entire 320 million Americans. It's a poll. It's representative. And if it's good enough for them, then I think 25 people by common law on a grand jury, or 23 by federal statute. When I was doing this initial research, I was in Florida. It's 21 in Florida statutes on a grand jury. And all these law review articles that I've read, they all refer to the grand jury as the voice of the community. They represent, it's a random selection of the people plopped into this grand jury to represent the people, to be their voice. 25 at common law, 23 in federal statute, 21 Florida statute. I think Virginia's at 9 or something like that. Anyways, across the country, the different states have different systems, which is an issue, which I'll dig into at some point in this series, but I'm just kind of wetting your whistle right now. So what is the Bill of Rights? What is the Fifth Amendment specifically? Remember, it's an instruction to the government. It's not our document where it tells us what to do. It's written by we the people. We tell them what to do. It's an instruction and a restriction placed upon the government. The Bill of Rights is not a list of rights. It's a list of protections. And the Fifth Amendment says, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless by a presentment or indictment of a grand jury. Let's dig into some of the words here. Again, it's an instruction to them. It says, no person shall be held to answer. Scalia called it a buffer or referee between the government and the people. If the government wants to accuse you of a crime, they have to go to the grand jury first. They have to go to the people first. The grand jury as a shield, a sword and a shield. By the way, let me dig into that for a second. Looking at these grand jury handbooks, and I'm looking at these textbooks and these law review articles throughout history, they all refer to the grand jury as a sword and a shield. It's a shield because it protects people from wrongful accusations. If the government wants to accuse you of a crime, they have to go to the grand jury first. They have to go to the people first to say, hey, is there enough evidence here to then go ahead and charge them with a crime? Because if you remember, the grand jury, the grand jury does not determine guilt or innocence. The grand jury only looks at enough evidence. Is there probable cause? Is there enough evidence to charge that person with a crime? And then they are sent to a petite jury where then they have the opportunity to defend themselves, cross-examine witnesses, face their accuser, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The grand jury doesn't determine if you're guilty. We have this thing, well, so-and-so was indicted today. That doesn't mean they're guilty. That just means there was enough evidence brought to them by the government to determine whether or not they should be charged and then tried and allow them to defend themselves. That's all it means. But that's why they're a shield, because they can protect people from wrongful accusations. But why are they a sword? Because they can actually go on offense. They can actually initiate their own investigations. That, my friends, is the key. So when you dig into the language of the Fifth Amendment, it says, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime. Now, you got to dig into these words, their definitions, how they're defined today, how are they defined when they were written, how are they defined prior to that. Because the founders didn't create this system of justice. They didn't create the jury system, the grand jury or petit jury. That came with them from England through the common law. A lot of these textbooks and grand jury handbooks will refer back to the Magna Carta, but there are some documents even prior to Magna Carta that led up to Magna Carta that created this concept of being judged by a jury of your peers. Instead of just being judged by the state, tried by the state, convicted by the state, you actually need to be tried and convicted by a jury of your peers, by the people. That is the essence of self-government. So that is the essence. So it is capital or otherwise infamous crime. Capital crime, I've seen definitions where they say where the punishment can be death, capital crime, it's the big one, murder, etc. Or otherwise infamous crime. Cornell law defined it, says at common law it was fraud and dishonesty. Well, fraud and dishonesty is a really big bucket. There's a lot of fraud and dishonesty going on right now. There's some places that will say, well, if the punishment can be 1 year or more in jail, that's otherwise infamous crime. But again, it says, no person shall be held to answer for these crimes unless it's reviewed by a grand jury. That's a really big deal. That's a very big deal. Where the government can't just charge people these crimes willy-nilly. They have to go to the people first for their permission. Now, there's a lot of state constitutions that I believe violate that. And if the Supremacy Clause says this Constitution and the laws in pursuance thereof, the laws that follow the Constitution, is the supreme law of the land, then I believe there are some state constitutions that are unconstitutional. Ha! Try that one on for size. And we're going to have those discussions in this entire series because there's a lot of stuff to unpack with this. There's a lot of historical documents to unpack with this. And I'm going to show you how in 1946, the coup d'etat, that's not my interpretation, it's not my word. I'm quoting a law review article from the Yale Law Journal in 1994 that referred to what happened in 1946 as a travesty. But it says again, no person shall be held to answer for these crimes unless by a presentment or indictment of a grand jury. That's the key. We all know what an indictment is, but the word presentment. Prior to me just now saying that, prior to this video, had you ever heard of a presentment before? In me, prior to doing the research for the book, I had no idea what that was. I had no idea that word was there. Yeah, I'd read the Constitution, that kind of stuff, and read here and there, especially when the issues of the day led me to open the book up and, take a look at the Constitution. But I don't remember reading the word presentment. And in fact, in all my travels, whenever I speak about this, and I show Black's Law Dictionary, Bovier's Law Dictionary, and all these historical writings talking about this stuff, these attorneys will stand up and say, oh, that's not how it works. I'm like, look, I get it. You went to law school. If you were sick or you overslept the day they talked about the Constitution in law school, you probably missed it. But I doubt that they even talked about presentment. The 99% of them never heard of it. In fact, the only attorney that I remember that ever heard of presentment and then defined it accurately, historically, was Senator Marco Rubio's general counsel in D.C. I met him through a friend, started talking about the book, and I went right to presentment. You ever heard of it? Oh, yeah. And he talked about it. I'm like, oh, my gosh. Somebody actually heard of it. So an indictment in that case is where the government brings the case to the grand jury and they indict somebody. But a presentment is where the grand jury, on their own initiative, can open up an investigation. Now, there's attorneys today that will say a presentment is just a report. It's a presentation. Now, I would argue that why would they word the Fifth Amendment like that? And there's lots of historical stories prior to 1946, by the way, that run counter to that. there's a lot of these law review articles that will tell you that, at the time of common law, prior to 1946, if you will, presentment was just as powerful as an indictment. Didn't require the signature of the prosecutor, et cetera, et cetera. It was truly independent, as Scalia confirmed in 1992. But that's why it's a sword also, because the grand jury, on their own initiative, can open up an investigation and root out corruption. But why don't people know that they can do that when they're on a grand jury? Well, today we have this scenario where, a grand jury can indict a prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich. That's the cliche, right? Well, why is that? Because the people on a grand jury have no idea that it's there. They have no idea what they can do. Let me show you something. In my book, on page 110 at the bottom of 110, there's a paragraph that exists today in the Florida Grand Jury Handbook. So in Florida, 67 counties, every single county has a grand jury at all times. When you serve in the grand jury in Florida, you serve for 6 months. And they're provided a handbook. And in the handbook, it says, the grand jury, in addition to the duty of formally indicting those charged with crime, has the further important duty of making investigations on its own initiative, which it will report as a presentment. See how they water it down a little bit? This duty permits investigation of how public officials are conducting their offices and discharging their public trusts. The grand jury may investigate as to whether public institutions are being properly administered. Go to Hoyt.me. I'll send you the show notes, link to the book, etc., etc. This duty permits investigations of how public officials are conducting their offices and discharging their public trusts. The grand jury may investigate as to whether public institutions are being properly administered and conducted. It has the power to inspect those institutions and, if necessary, may call before the grand jury those in charge of the operations of public institutions, as well as any other person who has information and can testify concerning them. If the grand jury finds that an unlawful, improper, or corrupt condition exists, it may recommend a remedy. Excuse me. Goodness gracious. So right there, it exists. Presentment exists. Now, what happened in 1946? Again, I'm giving you a very broad overview of this. There's a process called codification, where a common law practice is codified into code. It's put into law, put into statute, common law practice. Now, even digging into the word common law, the definition historically has changed over time. If you ask attorneys, they say one thing. A lot of them today, they'll say common law is judge-made law. It's case law, precedent. Back in the day, I found definitions that would say customs and usages as determined by the people. So at the common law days of the grand jury, this is how it operated. Why? Because it was outside the branches of government. It's not in the body of the Constitution. It's mentioned in the Fifth Amendment, but it's a fixture in its own right. And actually, I just quoted Scalia from a Supreme Court case in 1992. But the common law practice of the grand jury handled things in a certain way. And in 1946, the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure was passed, and it codified the common law practice of the grand jury. It codified into code how it's supposed to operate. And lo and behold, conveniently, I think, what was it, Rule 6, Rule 7, something like that, in the footnote, it said presentments are obsolete. They left the presentment process out, where a grand jury on their own initiative can open up investigations. On the federal level, they left that out of the criminal procedures. So since 1946, presentments haven't occurred really at the federal level. Grand juries on their own initiative don't. It's like they're the voice of the people, the voice of the community. They're representing us. It's just you and me, regular Joes on a grand jury. And when we have interest and say, you know what, we need to look at Hunter Biden's laptop. We need to look at why did the FBI sit on it. We need to look at how did they collude with big tech to censor people and violate the First Amendment protection of our natural God-given right to speak our minds. which I'm not saying what we can dig into all that. Big tech has a right to censor you. Absolutely. It's their platform. It's their property. When I check off the terms and conditions, I should know better. But the government, the First Amendment protects my God-given right to free speech from being abridged by government. The First Amendment doesn't protect me from being censored by big tech. The First Amendment says the government cannot censor me. So when the government uses this election integrity project, this 4 organizations, they use these nonpartisan whatever organizations, they use them to censor me in big tech. That's a problem. The First Amendment is supposed to protect against that. So if I was on a grand jury, I'd be initiating those kind of investigations and so many more. So many more. But why hasn't that happened? Why doesn't every single grand jury, every single county in Florida, why aren't they opening up investigations? I mean, even if the county commission voted on some new construction project and county seat number 4's cousin got a no-bid landscaping contract, a grand jury can investigate that and see if at least ethics violations are being violated. I mean, it's how powerful. Can you imagine how every single government official would act if they knew at any moment, any random moment, their phone could ring and they could be hauled before a grand jury to testify about their operations? Now, they don't know who's on the grand jury because it's secret. And that's purposeful, and that's a good thing. Because the media can't intimidate them and ruin their lives. The mob can't intimidate them because they don't know. Politicians can't threaten them through their goons and all of that because they're secret. So how would every government official act if they knew at any given moment their phone could ring and they could be hauled off before a grand jury to testify about their operations and held accountable? Let me tell you what the Supreme Court said in 1992. Ay. Now you got me started. Scalia, writing for the majority opinion in U.S. versus Williams in a 6-3 majority, wrote this. And here's several quotes. Now, what he was doing, in the book, I took out all the references so you could read it smoothly. But when you actually read the case, you'll see it's not just him talking. It's not just his opinion. He's actually citing a bunch of other Supreme Court cases. He's citing a lot of historical writings, etc. He says, because the grand jury is an institution separate from the courts, because our connotation is a grand jury house, and it's in the judicial building. It's part of the judicial system. It's in the courthouse. It must be part of the judicial branch. It's not. That's why I said in the first 3 articles of the Constitution, it didn't assign the grand jury to any of those institutions because it was an institution that existed before the Constitution was written. And it was never assigned, therefore it's still supposed to be in the people's control. Because the grand jury is an institution separate from the courts, over whose functioning the courts do not preside, we think it clear that, as a general matter at least, no such supervisory judicial authority exists. Rooted in long centuries of Anglo-American history, the grand jury is mentioned in the Bill of Rights, but not in the body of the Constitution. It has not been textually assigned, therefore, to any of the branches described in the first 3 articles. It's a constitutional fixture in its own right. Again, this is Scalia writing for the majority in 1992. In fact, the whole theory of its function is that it belongs to no branch of the institutional government, serving as a kind of buffer or referee between the government and the people. Although the grand jury normally operates, of course, in the courthouse and under judicial auspices, its institutional relationship with the judicial branch has traditionally been, so to speak, at arm's length. Judges' direct involvement in the functioning of the grand jury has generally been confined to the constitutive one of calling the grand jurors together and administering their oaths of office. The grand jury's functional independence from the judicial branch is evident both in the scope of its power to investigate criminal wrongdoing and in the manner in which that power is exercised. Unlike a court whose jurisdiction is predicated upon a specific case or controversy, the grand jury can investigate merely on suspicion that the law is being violated, or even because it wants assurance that it is not. Right now, think of all these cases that a grand jury should initiate on their own initiative, should bring up, should investigate, just to make sure laws are not being violated. The grand jury requires no authorization from its constituting court to initiate an investigation. Again, Supreme Court, Scalia, writing for the majority, 1992. Nor does the prosecutor require leave of court to seek a grand jury indictment. And in its day-to-day functioning, the grand jury generally operates without the interference of a presiding judge. It swears in its own witnesses and deliberates in total secrecy. Even in this setting, however, we have insisted that the grand jury remain free to pursue its investigations unhindered by external influence or supervision, so long as it does not trench upon the legitimate rights of any witness called before it. Recognizing this tradition of independence, we have said that the Fifth Amendment's constitutional guarantee presupposes an investigative body acting independently of either prosecuting attorney or judge. Given the grand jury's operational separateness from its constituting court, it should come as no surprise that we have been reluctant to invoke the judicial supervisory power as a basis for prescribing modes of grand jury procedure. Anyways, I tell you what, there's so much here. This will be a good introduction. I'm planting the seeds here, kind of wetting the whistle. We the people are hungry for accountability across the board, local, state, federal. And this idea that hopefully this November, because they're like, confidence in the election system right now is pretty low. Because of the system, because of the technology, because of the, well, can I say fraud? Or at least the opportunity for it. This idea that we have to wait for the next election and maybe, just maybe, we can hold our government accountable. That's not what the founders created. There's a system that's been in place for over 800 years. And what they did to it in 1946, and there's still remnants of it today. Like in Virginia, for example, I believe Virginia, if you're on a grand jury, there's 9 people on a grand jury. If 7 of the 9 get together and say, hey, we'd like to investigate this issue over here, then those 7 will come over here and create a new grand jury. 2 additional people will come in from the jury pool, and that will be referred to as a special grand jury with a mission. That exists today. They're not told that. They don't know that, because I guarantee through the years, grand juries in Virginia would be opening up in special grand juries all the time. Anyways, I'd love to hear from you guys. We have a group over at the Liberty Restoration Society. Go to hoyt.me. That's hoyt.me. I'll send you an email with a special invite to our online community. And I look forward to communicating with you guys over there. And I'll be putting more videos out in this series. And I promise when I do, I won't have this little tickle in my throat and this cough. But God bless you guys. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.